Everyone likes a good haunted house movie, so I'm going to tell you 10 haunted house horror movies that I would recommend. It's funny because before I started thinking about this list, there doesn't seem to be a lot of haunted house horror movies. I thought there'd be hundreds or thousands of these films, but it turns out there's not that many, especially not that many that are actually decent enough to recommend to you. Now, I am going to include some obvious ones, but I'm also going to leave out some obvious ones as well, because I want you to come to this list and think, okay, out of these 10 movies, there's at least one that I've not seen that maybe I should watch. First up, we've got The Others from 2001, starring Nicole Kidman. This is one that came out of the blue for me because with the high that I had with watching The Sixth Sense, I wanted to see a ghost film that had a really good twist again. And I think The Others is a film that has an even better twist than the twist that we got in The Sixth Sense. I'm obviously not going to tell you the twist, of course, but it is a really good one. That is a really good payoff at the end of the film. But throughout this whole film, it's got that eerie atmosphere to it. It is set in just after or during the war in the 1930s to the 1940s. So it's got a really good setting to it as well, really good mood and atmosphere. And it's about this family that are living in this mansion in the middle of nowhere in England. So the premise itself is enough to sell it. Acting's fantastic as well, some really good jump scares as well, and as well as the end of the film with that great payoff with the twist. Next up, we've got The Conjuring from 2013, one of the newer films on the list. Now, if you haven't seen this one, I highly recommend this one because it feels like a haunted house horror film that was shot in the 70s. It's just got that really nice, crisp 70s vibe to it. Obviously, it's set in the 70s as well. And it's about this family that move into this house, like they usually do, and there's paranormal activity within the house, and they get Ed and Lorraine Warren to come in and investigate it to see if there's any ghosts around there. It does feel really realistic as well. It's got some amazing jump scares in it, and it doesn't have pointless jump scares. It's got those classic build-ups that you would get in the 80s and the 90s, because that was all lost by the time The Conjuring came out. So when we got that callback to the classic haunted house horror film, it was a refreshing change. Next up, we've got The Conjuring 2 from 2016. Now, of course, it's not as good as the first film, but it's still a really good film. It's got all the beats that we had from the original one with the great build-up of the jump scares, some really out-of-the-blue jump scares as well. The only issue that I have with The Conjuring 2 is I'm from the UK, so I know that this story in The Conjuring 2 is a hoax. Now, of course, most true stories when it comes to haunted houses are hoaxes anyway, but I think because it's an obvious hoax from where I live, that it takes away that realism factor to it. But if you ignore the fact that it's obviously fake, I think you would get some really good scares out of this one. Next, we've got Poltergeist from 1982. Now, I've only seen this movie a handful of times, maybe 3 or 4 times, and I watched it recently hoping that it would live up to how old the film is. You know, the film is over 42 years old now, so when it comes to movies that old, sometimes I dread it, watching it again after a few years, but this one really holds up. I know this film was directed by Toby Hooper, but it has got that Steven Spielberg vibe to it. Maybe he directed most of it, you don't know, but it's still got some good scares in it. It did spawn a few sequels that were not too bad, but I think the original is the best one to watch. For being an older film, it's got great acting in it, some dodgy practical effects, as well as some really good practical effects, some memorable moments that you're always going to remember for the rest of your life as well. But yeah, this is one of the ones on the list that I had to include because it is a classic. Not my favourite, but it is a classic when it comes to the haunted house subgenre. Next, we've got the Amityville Horror from 2005. This is the remake to the 1979 classic. Now, when I do this classic, it's because I don't actually like the original. The original is not on this list, so that's a spoiler alert for you guys. There's something about the original that just feels kind of boring to me. Not much happens in it. I do like the slow burn horror films when it comes to slow burn, but I think the Amityville Horror takes that to the extreme because not much happens in that film. I remembered enjoying it at the time, but I don't think time has been kind to the original film. So I have to put the 2005 remake on there because that one has all the information that you need for the true story of the Amityville Horror, but it gives you a little bit more twists and turns to it. It amps up the horror, it amps up the gore and the jump scares as well. And I think the acting is a little bit better as well. Next, we've got House from 1985. This one's a little bit more light-hearted because of some comedy elements to it, but it has got some horror elements to it as well. And even the backstory of the main character is quite disturbing because he had a kid that went missing, doesn't know where his kid went. He's an ex-war veteran as well, so he's got a bit of PTSD. His wife left him, his grandmother died, so he moved into a haunted house. There's a lot of information there for that guy that he has to live through, so it's quite hard for him to live with. But he's in this house, he's trying to investigate strange happenings that's went on in the house, as well as try and find the mystery of where his son went, because his son went missing in the swimming pool in that house. So he's still trying to figure out everything that's happened there. Some good twists and turns in it, some really good jump scares as well, but ultimately it is a comedy movie and it is quite funny as well. Next up, we've got The Frighteners from 1996. Quite similar to House, where it's more of a comedy than a horror. When the horror hits, it's really good. So it's got a really good backstory as well. Amazing acting from Michael J. Fox, one of his last roles before retiring. And it's just an all-round good feel horror film directed by Peter Jackson, of course, before he went on to do the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So you know you've got a competent director there. The special effects haven't dated very well, I'll say that. But at the time, I thought the effects were out of this world. But the CGI is dated, of course, but it's still an enjoyable film. And it's one of those films where it's got some really good, memorable moments, some great quotes that I still quote to these days, like,
"Piss on your hush puppies."
Next up, we've got Paranormal Activity from 2007. With the success of the Blair Witch Project, there hadn't been anything anywhere near as successful to the Blair Witch since 1999. A lot of found footage movies came out and they kind of failed. Most of them weren't that good. But I think what Paranormal Activity done well was they spent even less money and they still went to that point where what you don't see makes it scarier. Whereas a lot of the found footage movies between the Blair Witch and Paranormal Activity made that mistake. They tried to show you too much. And if you're doing a found footage movie that's supposed to be realistic, it just doesn't work. So Paranormal Activity went back to the roots of the Blair Witch Project, showed you as little as possible, but still made it scary. And to top it off, it was about a ghost in a haunted house. Next up, we've got Paranormal Activity 3 from 2011. And you might be thinking, well, where's Paranormal Activity 2? That's a good film, but it's not on the list. And for those of you who know me will know that I think Paranormal Activity 3 is the best movie in the Paranormal Activity franchise. It took everything that was great from the first film, and then they gave us a film that's set in the 80s. Now, I love 80s horror films, but I love it when it looks like it's supposed to be set in the 80s, and that's exactly what we got with Paranormal Activity 3. They used old technology with the VHS tapes. They had to do there was scenes where the dad or the boyfriend had to put a video camera on an old fan that was moving left to right. The camera work was fantastic. The idea behind it was great, setting it before the events of Paranormal Activity 1. So everything that I loved about Paranormal Activity 1 is here, only it's an 80s version. Last up, we've got The Entity from 1982. This is a good one because it's more psychological than paranormal. Yes, we get the paranormal events where a woman was sexually attacked by a ghost and nobody's believing this woman, so it is kind of psychological as well, where she's trying to convince people that there's a ghost in the house, which is hard enough to do, but also say that she was abused by this ghost as well. So there's so many layers to this film that it gives a more deep meaning to it than most of the films on this list. But with those psychological aspects aside, the ghost parts of the film were really good. The haunted house aspects were really good. There are some directors out there as well that say that this is one of the scariest movies that they've ever seen. I wouldn't go that far. It's not so scary that you shouldn't watch the movie or anything. It has got some really good scary moments in it, but ultimately it's a good balance between that haunted house and the psychological aspect. So that's 10 haunted house horror movies that I would recommend to you guys. If you've seen any of them, let me know what you thought of them down below. If you haven't seen them, I highly recommend them. But is there any other haunted house horror movies that you would recommend? Leave a list of those haunted house horror movies down below, guys. And as always, thanks a lot for watching. Thanks for subscribing, and I'll see you soon.
Meeting adjourned.
I'll be right back.
What are you waiting for, huh? Coming to get you, Barbara.
Ever played in the cat?
Someone's in the back!